Before dawn, in Athens, in the years after Zeno of Citium had died, an old man drew water from a public well and carried it in 2 clay jars through the still dark streets to the gardens, whose owners paid him a small coin for the labor. He was said to be past 70, and the muscles of his shoulders were the muscles of a boxer, grown lean with age, and when the sun came, he would walk to the painted porch and teach philosophy for no fee at all. On this morning, however, a magistrate of the city had stopped him in the road and demanded to know how a man without visible trade could feed himself and stand upright in the assembly of citizens. Cleanthes said nothing, but led the magistrate to the gardener, who paid him for the water, and to the woman who paid him to grind her barley by night. And the magistrate, we are told by Diogenes Laertius, offered him a pension from the public treasury, so that he need not labor so hard for his bread. Cleanthes refused. He returned that evening to the well, and to the mill, and to the porch, and continued as before. This is the man we will sit with today, not Zeno, who founded the school, not Chrysippus, who systematized it into the great edifice that would carry Stoicism into the Roman world, but Cleanthes of Assos, the second head of the Stoa, the water carrier, the man whose name the tradition preserves chiefly because he would not stop working and would not stop learning and would not permit either poverty or age or the mockery of his fellow students to interrupt the daily labor by which a soul is made. The principle we will draw from his life is this: philosophy is not an insight one has. Philosophy is a labor one performs, and endurance, the quiet capacity to return each day to the same task without theatrics and without complaint, is not a supporting virtue in the Stoic scheme. It is the ground on which every other virtue stands. Let us begin by naming the principle plainly, as Cleanthes would have named it. The Stoics inherited from Zeno a division of philosophy into 3 parts: logic, physics, and ethics. They compared these parts, we are told, to an orchard in which logic was the wall, physics the trees, and ethics the fruit. But an orchard is not a diagram. An orchard is a place where a man rises in the dark and carries water and prunes and waits through seasons in which nothing appears to happen and returns the next morning to do it again. The metaphor, if you take it seriously, is a metaphor of endurance. The fruit is not produced by insight. The fruit is produced by the years. Cleanthes seems to have understood this in his very bones. Diogenes Laertius records that when his fellow students mocked him for his slowness, calling him an ass, he replied that he alone was strong enough to carry the burden of Zeno's teaching. When they called him dull, he said that he was hard to move because he was set deep. He did not defend himself by claiming brilliance. He defended himself by claiming persistence. And this, one must consider, is a very unusual defense because it does not appeal to any quality that would ordinarily be admired in a philosopher. It appeals only to the willingness to continue. The Greek word that stands nearest to what we are describing here is karteria, which we translate as endurance or steadfastness or the capacity to bear. It is a word the Stoics used often, and it belongs to a family of terms that includes hypomone, patient waiting, and enkratia, self-mastery. But karteria has a particular flavor. It is not the endurance of the sufferer who grits his teeth against pain. It is the endurance of the laborer who lifts the same weight tomorrow that he lifted today and the day before and the year before, and does not ask when the labor will end, because the labor is the life. Zeno himself, according to the tradition, praised Cleanthes precisely for this quality. He is said to have called him a second Heracles, because Heracles was the Stoic emblem of the man who accepts his labors without protest, and Cleanthes accepted his. But Heracles was a hero, and his labors were monstrous. Cleanthes carried water. The point, and it is a Stoic point, is that the two are the same labor viewed at different scales. To lift the Nemean lion and to lift the water jar are morally identical acts, because in both cases a man does what is set before him without turning away. Now the principle so stated may sound to you like a counsel of grim persistence, and I want to be careful here, because Cleanthes was not grim. His writings, of which we possess only fragments, are marked by a strange serenity. His hymn to Zeus, which has come down to us nearly intact, is not the poem of a man clenching his jaw against the world. It is the poem of a man who has understood that the world's order is worth participating in, and who wishes to participate in it with the small strength he has. We shall return to this hymn later. For now, hold the principle in mind. Endurance is not a grim virtue. Endurance is the quiet form of joy that belongs to a soul which has stopped bargaining with its life. Let us now consider the circumstance in which Cleanthes worked out this understanding. He was born, we are told, in Assos, a small city on the coast of the Troad, in Asia Minor, sometime around the year 331 before the Common Era. His father was of modest means. Before he came to philosophy, Cleanthes was a boxer, and he arrived in Athens, according to Diogenes Laertius, with 4 drachmas in his possession, which was not enough to live on for a week. He attended first the lectures of Crates the Cynic, and then of Zeno, and it was with Zeno that he stayed. Athens in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries before the Common Era was no longer the Athens of Pericles. The city had been humbled by Macedon, first under Philip and then under Alexander, and by the time Cleanthes arrived, it was a city of philosophers rather than of statesmen. The great schools were established, the Academy of Plato, still functioning under Plato's successors, the Lyceum of Aristotle under Theophrastus, the Garden of Epicurus, newly founded, and the painted porch, the Stoa Poikile, where Zeno taught. These schools were not universities. They were communities, gathered around a teacher, meeting in public colonnades or private gardens, and they were open to the poor as well as to the rich, provided one could feed oneself while attending. Cleanthes could not feed himself. He had spent his 4 drachmas, and so he took work at night, drawing water from the wells and carrying it to the gardens of those who could pay, and grinding barley in a mill for a woman who paid him by the measure. During the day, he sat with Zeno. He slept, one presumes, in fragments, and he was often hungry, and he had no cloak worth mentioning. And Diogenes Laertius preserves a story that when the wind blew his threadbare garment aside in the assembly and revealed how thin he had become, the Athenians applauded him, recognizing in his body the evidence of his devotion. Consider this scene for a moment. An old man, a foreigner, standing in the assembly of a city, not his own, his clothes falling open to show the marks of his poverty, and the citizens applauding, not despite his condition, but because of it. What they were applauding, one must consider, was not poverty as such. They were applauding what the poverty demonstrated. Here was a man who had chosen the labor of philosophy over the comforts of an easier trade. and who had accepted the physical cost of that choice without complaint, and who was still standing. The magistrate's offer of a public pension came, we are told, from this same recognition. The Athenians did not wish to see one of their philosophers starving, but Cleanthes refused, and the refusal is instructive. He did not refuse because he disdained the money. He refused because the labor itself was part of his practice. To be relieved of the labor would have been to be relieved of a portion of his philosophy. He would not permit it. There is another story from this period, and I want to give it to you as Diogenes Laertius gives it, because it captures something essential. Cleanthes, we are told, had no papyrus on which to write down what Zeno taught. Papyrus was expensive, and he had no money for it, and so he wrote Zeno's words on ostraca, on pieces of broken pottery, and on the shoulder blades of oxen, which he presumably found or was given by butchers. He carried these fragments home at night and studied them, and this was how the doctrines of the Stoa were in part preserved for him. Think of what this means as a daily practice. To take down a philosophical lecture on a shard of pottery is not to be a scholar in any comfortable sense. It is to be a man who has decided that the words matter enough to be scratched into whatever surface is available. It is to have chosen philosophy in the way a starving man chooses bread, and it is to have done so night after night in a foreign city, past the age when most men have settled into whatever life they are going to have. Cleanthes studied with Zeno, according to the tradition, for 19 years. 19 years of drawing water at night, of grinding barley, of sitting on the porch by day, of scratching notes on bone and pottery, of being called dull and slow by fellow students who found him wanting in quickness. 19 years. And at the end of these 19 years, when Zeno died in 262 before the Common Era, it was Cleanthes whom the school chose as its next head. Not the brilliant Ariston, not the subtle Herillus. Cleanthes, the water carrier. He led the Stoa for 32 years after that. He was by then an old man, and he grew older, and he continued to teach, and he continued to write, and the tradition tells us that he composed a great many works, of which we possess almost nothing but titles and fragments. On time, on the natural science of Zeno, on sensation, on pleasure, on duty, and many others. He composed the hymn to Zeus, which we will hear from in a moment. And he continued, "One gathers to live simply, to eat little, and to labor with his hands when labor was needed." He died, according to Diogenes Laertius, by starvation, and the story of his death is worth telling because it belongs to the same pattern. In his old age, his gums became inflamed, and the physicians instructed him to abstain from food for 2 days to allow the inflammation to subside. He did so. After the 2 days, the inflammation had lessened, and the physicians told him he might resume eating. But Cleanthes refused. He said that since he had already traveled so far on the road, he would not turn back, and he continued to abstain from food until he died. He was by then past 90. One must be careful with a story like this. It is easy to romanticize, and it is easy also to condemn as a kind of pointless austerity. But I think what Cleanthes was doing at the very end was continuing the practice he had begun as a young man carrying water in the dark. He had spent his life declining to bargain with the labor set before him. When death was the labor set before him, he declined to bargain with that as well. It is of a piece with everything else he did. Let us now consider how the principle of endurance actually functioned in his life and what he wrote about it, so that we may see it not as a biographical curiosity, but as a working philosophy. The hymn to Zeus, which is the longest continuous fragment of Cleanthes that has survived, begins with an address to the god as the ruler of nature, whose law extends through all things, and it proceeds to praise the god's ordering wisdom. But at a certain point in the hymn, Cleanthes says something that I want you to hold with care. He says that nothing is done upon the earth apart from the god, except what bad men do in their folly, and he asks the god to disperse the darkness from the souls of men, and to grant them the understanding by which the God himself governs all things with justice, so that they may honor him in return with reasoned praise, singing his works forever, since neither for mortals nor for gods is there any greater privilege than this, to sing in justice of the universal law. Now listen to what this hymn is doing. It is not the hymn of a man who has arrived at wisdom and now praises the god from a position of achievement. It is the hymn of a man who is asking still to be given the understanding by which he may participate rightly in the order of things. It is the prayer of a laborer, and it presumes that the labor is not a preliminary to wisdom, but the very form that wisdom takes in a human life. The Stoic doctrine, as Cleanthes received it from Zeno, and as he transmitted it to Chrysippus, held that the universe is governed by a rational principle, the logos, and that to live well is to live in accordance with this principle. But what does it mean, in the concrete texture of a day, to live in accordance with the logos? It means, Cleanthes seems to have thought, to accept what is given and to labor at what is set before you, and to do so without theatrics, because theatrics are a form of resistance. The man who complains about his labor has already stepped outside of it. He has made himself a spectator of his own life. The man who simply labors is inside it, and being inside it is what accord with the logos means. There is a saying attributed to Cleanthes, preserved by Seneca in one of his letters to Lucilius, which Seneca himself learned from Cleanthes through the tradition. The saying in Latin is "Ducunt volentem fata, nolentem trahunt." The fates lead the willing and drag the unwilling. Seneca gives this as a translation of Cleanthes' Greek, and what Cleanthes seems to have meant by it is not that we should submit passively to whatever befalls us, but that the labor is going to occur whether we consent to it or not. The day is going to require of you what it requires. The only question is whether you will meet the day, or whether the day will drag you behind it. Endurance, in Cleanthes' understanding, is simply the choice to walk beside one's own life rather than to be dragged by it. Notice how modest this is. It is not a heroic doctrine. It does not promise that you will feel triumphant, or that you will overcome your circumstances, or that anyone will notice. It promises only that you will not be dragged, that you will walk, that the water will be carried, and the mill will be turned, and the lecture will be attended, and the notes will be scratched onto pottery, and the next day will begin as this one began. There is one more piece of the record I want to bring before you, because it shows how Cleanthes handled the mockery of his slower parts, and it goes to the heart of what endurance meant for him. Diogenes Laertius tells us that Cleanthes was called an ass by his fellow students because he was slow to learn. His response, as I mentioned earlier, was to say that he alone was strong enough to bear the burden of Zeno's teaching. But there is a further story. When someone reproached him for his fearfulness or for what appeared to be timidity in argument, he replied, "That is why I make so few mistakes." Consider what is being said here. Cleanthes is not claiming to be quick. He is not claiming to be brilliant. He is not even claiming to be brave in the ordinary sense. He is claiming something much smaller and much harder. He is claiming that his slowness, his caution, his willingness to be laughed at rather than to speak beyond what he knows is itself a philosophical virtue. He is claiming that the tortoise's progress is real progress, and that the hare's brilliance, unaccompanied by the labor of return, is not a virtue at all. This is very close, one must consider, to what the tradition would later come to mean by Procope, moral progress. Procope is not sudden. Procope is not dramatic. Procope is the incremental improvement of a soul across many years of small choices, most of which will not be visible even to the person making them. Cleanthes, in his slowness and his labor and his refusal to be hurried, is the very image of Procope. He is what the doctrine looks like when it is being lived out over decades in the body of a specific man. And so when the school chose him, upon Zeno's death, as the successor, they were not choosing the most brilliant of Zeno's students. They were choosing the one who had shown, over 19 years, that he understood what the philosophy actually was. The philosophy was not a set of propositions to be mastered. The philosophy was a way of moving through the days. Cleanthes had moved through his days in accordance with it. That was the qualification. Let us now consider what the structural lesson is for us from this life. The first thing to be said is that Cleanthes offers a correction to a temptation that afflicts every student of philosophy, ancient and modern. The temptation is to believe that the goal of philosophy is a certain kind of insight, and that once one has attained the insight, one has arrived. The Stoic school, as Cleanthes understood it, denied this from beginning to end. There is no arrival. There is only the daily labor of returning to the practice. And the practice consists in doing what is set before you, in accord with reason, without adding to it either complaint or self-congratulation. The second thing to be said is that endurance, as Cleanthes practiced it, was not the endurance of the sufferer. It was the endurance of the laborer. This is a distinction worth pausing over. The sufferer endures what is done to him. The laborer endures what he himself is doing. The sufferer's endurance is passive, and it tends toward bitterness, because the sufferer is always aware that his condition could be otherwise. The laborer's endurance is active, and it tends toward a kind of quiet contentment, because the laborer has chosen the work, and the work is his. Cleanthes could have taken the magistrate's pension. He could have accepted an easier life. He did not, because the labor was, for him, the philosophy. To be relieved of the labor would have been to be relieved of the philosophy. And so his endurance was not the endurance of a man trapped in a hard life. It was the endurance of a man who had chosen a hard life and who continued each day to choose it. The third thing to be said, and this is the hardest, is that the practice of endurance is largely invisible, both to others and to oneself. Cleanthes drew water in the dark. No one saw him. He scratched notes on pottery by lamplight. No one saw him. He sat on the porch and was called an ass, and he continued to sit. Very little of what made him a philosopher was visible even to himself as it was happening. It became visible, in retrospect, in the 19th year, when Zeno died and the school chose him. But it was there all along. It was there in the 2nd year, and the 5th year, and the 12th, when nothing appeared to be happening, and when Cleanthes himself perhaps did not know that anything was happening. This is, one must consider, the hardest thing about the Stoic practice. It offers no feedback. It offers no daily confirmation that you are doing it correctly. It offers only the labor itself, and the trust that the labor is what philosophy is. Cleanthes seems to have trusted this. He seems to have believed that if he continued to draw the water, and continued to sit on the porch, and continued to be who he was without theatrics, then whatever was to become of his soul would become of it in its own time. There is a temptation, when speaking of a figure like Cleanthes, to make him more than he was, to make him a saint, or a hero, or an emblem. He would have resisted this. He was, by his own account, a slow student, a laborer, a man who made few mistakes because he moved cautiously. He was not a great original thinker. Chrysippus, who succeeded him, was the greater systematizer, and the tradition acknowledges this openly. Without Chrysippus, it was said, there would have been no Stoa, but without Cleanthes, there would have been no Chrysippus, because Cleanthes preserved and transmitted what Zeno had taught, and he did so by the daily labor of transmission, and this labor is not lesser than the labor of original thought. It is the ground on which original thought is possible. Consider what this means for you as a listener, as a student of these matters. You may not be a great original thinker. You may be, like Cleanthes, one of the slow ones, the ones who are called asses by the quicker students, the ones who make few mistakes because they do not risk much. This is not a lesser condition. It is, in the Stoic understanding, a fully sufficient condition for the practice of philosophy. What is required of you is not brilliance. What is required of you is that you draw the water tonight, and again tomorrow, and again the night after, without asking whether it matters, because the drawing is what it means for it to matter. I want to close with a question, and I want you to carry it with you, rather than to answer it now. Cleanthes drew water in the dark for 19 years before the school recognized what he had become. For 19 years, he had no external evidence that his practice was working. He had only the practice itself, and he continued. The question is this: what is the labor set before you, which you have been performing without recognition, perhaps even without your own recognition, and which is quietly making you into whatever you are going to become? Not the labor you announce, not the labor for which you seek acknowledgement, the other labor, the one you do in the dark before the sun comes, because it has to be done, and because no one else will do it for you, the one that has no audience. If Cleanthes were sitting with you now on the porch in the early light before the students arrived, he would not ask you whether you had understood the doctrine. He would ask you whether you had drawn the water, and if you had, he would ask you whether you would draw it again tomorrow. And if you said yes, he would nod, and he would say nothing further, because there is nothing further to say. The labor is the philosophy, the return is the practice, the years are the proof, though there is no one to whom the proof needs to be shown. Go then, and draw the water. The porch will be there in the morning. And so, if you continue, will you?